Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the second session of Ethics for UBC, where we focus on ethics in technology. I'm Ari Rotenberg, and I will be your moderator today. Currently, I'm completing my master's in experimental medicine at Neuroethics Canada. I would like to first thank the President's Office for supporting this important initiative, and members of the organizing committee, Dr. Judy Hall, Dr. Judy Illes, Dr. Paul Van Donkelaar, Louise Harding, Marianne Bacani, and Anna Nectarline. I also want to let you know that this session will be recorded. In a moment, I will hand the mic to Dr. Gail Murphy to introduce the session. Dr. Gail C. Murphy, she, her, is a professor of computer science and vice president, research and innovation at the University of British Columbia. Dr. Murphy maintains an active research group and currently develops data identification and management tools for software developers and other knowledge workers. Dr. Murphy, please go ahead.
Thanks so much, Ari. I really appreciate that. Thanks everyone for joining this panel discussion on ethics and technology. I would like to start by acknowledging that UBC's Vancouver Point Grey campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people, and that UBC Okanagan is situated in the territory of the Syilx and Okanagan Nation and their peoples. I'm sure many of you are joining from many places far and near, and I hope that you'll take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of the lands that you're on. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's event, which is part of the Ethics for UBC series. And today we're focusing on ethics and technology. This is the second installation of Ethics for UBC. It's a 5-part series of panel discussions, as you've heard, organized by Dr. Judy Illes, Dr. Paul Van Donkelaar, and graduate student Louise Harding. I'd like to thank our colleagues for presenting this series and really highlighting the importance of understanding and investigating current and emerging issues in ethics. Researchers and scholars across UBC are addressing ethics-related topics across many different disciplines spanning the arts, science, health, social sciences, and the humanities. While many of these issues might be common across faculties and disciplines, others are domain-specific. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from our panelists today on their work and ideas around ethics and technology. As VP Research, I feel really proud and fortunate to have so many UBC researchers and scholars that are leading discussions about these important questions and really pushing our understanding and engagement with ethical issues on a national and international stage. Raising, examining, and confronting issues related to ethics can help researchers and scholars across our university, across disciplines, to understand the potential impact of our work on society. And after the last 2 years, I think we realize how many of these questions can come up daily and hourly. Advancing discussions around ethics also helps us bring a strong environment to conduct our research, teaching, and scholarship responsibly in ways that go significantly beyond simple compliance with requirements. So today I'm really excited to hear from our panelists whose work relates to the intersection of technology and ethics and how this dynamic impacts design and our physical environment, how we engage with technology emotionally, and how it impacts healthcare delivery. I'm sure you're going to enjoy today's discussion, and I encourage you to sign up for the remaining sessions in the series as well. And with that, please, Ari, take back the reins and introduce our panel and help us start off on this enjoyable discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Murphy. As an overview, this session will begin with 40 minutes of roundtable discussion amongst the panelists. After, we will have 10 minutes of general Q&A from our audience members. Then our panelists will be given a final prompt before the event concludes at 1 p.m. If you have further questions and would like to continue the conversation in a small group setting, you're invited to join a behind-the-scenes breakout room with a panelist from 1 to 1:15. You are welcome to bring questions we did not get to in the open session or new ones during this time. Each breakout room will be hosted by a member of Neuroethics Canada. You will be able to choose the breakout room you wish to join. Now I will introduce our panelists. Dr. Sharia Alam, PhD, is a professor of civil engineering, Principals Research Chair in Resilient and Green Infrastructure at UBC Okanagan, and Director of the Green Construction Research Training Center. He is the current chair of the Engineering, Mechanics, and Materials Division of the Canadian Society for Civil Engineering. Dr. Alam's research aims to integrate advanced, smart, and sustainable materials into civil engineering and construction practices. Professor Fionn Byrne is an assistant professor in the School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture here at UBC. Professor Byrne currently studies the nexus between humans and trees, such examples including trees planted by the US military in Afghanistan during Operation Enduring Freedom, as well as samples of old growth vegetation on the fringes of UBC's Point Grey campus. Dr. Julie Robillard is an assistant professor of neurology at the University of British Columbia and scientist in patient experience at BC Children's and Women's Hospitals. She leads the NEST lab, that is Neuroscience, Engagement, and Smart Tech, a part of Neuroethics Canada. Dr. Robillard's research explores interdisciplinary co-creation processes and ethical end-user engagement with technologies from social media to social robots. Dr. Patricia Rodney, RN, MSN, PhD, is an associate professor emerita at the UBC School of Nursing. Dr. Rodney has a long-standing interest in healthcare ethics, particularly in relation to end-of-life care for older adults and their families, as well as the moral support of healthcare providers. She has served as a leader in the Canadian Bioethics Society and shaped national policy regarding medical assistance in dying. Panelists, you will be presented with 3 guiding questions for our discussion today. To allow enough time for each person to speak, I'll ask you to please limit your answers to each to 90 seconds. I'm going to start by asking you to tell us about your area of interest and about others who share it at UBC Vancouver and Okanagan and opportunities to be involved. I'll start with Dr. Alam.
Thank you. My research area is, as you mentioned, in materials and structures. In this particular group, we have several people in the Okanagan as well as in Vancouver. So namely, Nemi Bantia, Perry Adebar. We also have Tony Young. In the Okanagan, we have Lisa Tober, who has recently joined. We have Solomon, we have Ahmad Ritil. Sorry, what was the other question you mentioned? Opportunities for others to collaborate?
Specifically opportunities for students to be involved.
Yeah. Of course, there are opportunities. Like always, we are looking for brilliant students who can join our group. On both campuses, we work together. For example, currently in our group, we have several postdoc, PhD, and master students we are looking for, as well as undergrad students. Thank you.
Thank you. Could you tell us a little bit about your area of interest, please?
My area of interest is in, maybe I can be a little bit specific. We are working on, sustainable construction materials and novel materials that could be used in structural applications to make structures safer and more sustainable that can reduce also carbon footprint. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now I'll pass it over to Professor Byrne. And as a reminder, the prompts are area of interest, others who share it across the UBC campuses, and opportunities for students to be involved.
Great, thank you so much. Great opportunity for me to be able to share my work here today. So I'll try to answer it quickly, but I'll take just a slight step back to say, so I'm an assistant professor teaching at the School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture, that's SALA, in the Faculty of Applied Sciences. And I teach primarily to students in the Master of Landscape Architecture program. This program is an accredited program by the Landscape Architecture Accreditation Council, that's of the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects. So to be successfully accredited, our program must demonstrate that we cover a set of topics deemed essential by the CSLA for training as a landscape architect. This also means that graduates of our program are then certified, which is a prerequisite to being licensed as a landscape architect in Canada. And ethics arise twice in the education of a landscape architect. This is the case in every accredited program across Canada. In the first instance, programs are required to teach environmental ethics and aesthetics as a component of history and theory classes. And the second time that ethics arise is ethics in professional practice. And so these two cases mirror the code of conduct for professionals by the CSLA. a landscape architect is expected to work with honesty and integrity, and also to follow a kind of non-human Hippocratic oath, acting for the betterment of the environment. So really that's where my research sits, is thinking about what does environmental betterment constitute? How do we know what that is, and how do we design it? That the accreditation requires that ethics is taught as a history theory or as a mode of professional practice. And my interest is seeing the relationship between design, how we bring a future world into being, and its relationship to an ethical decision making. So my particular research that you mentioned in the introduction is I'm looking currently at trees, several examples where I'm thinking about a couple old growth trees on the edge of campus. They've been there for more than 400 years, so longer than the entire colonial encounter here on the Point Grey campus. And so how can we design a relationship with those species? And then on the far other side of the spectrum, I'm looking at the US military's planting of trees in Afghanistan during Operation Enduring Freedom. In this case, the kind of mental health benefits that come from exposure to nature are seen not always as a benign good, and subject really of a critical inquiry to think about how mental benefits of exposure to nature have been weaponized in this context. Yeah, I think that covers it. You let me know if I've missed part of the question.
Thank you. I think, we may have missed part of it. Could you please tell us a little bit about how students could be involved?
Yeah, so, the research that I do spins out into my teaching, and so the students in the master's program are, engaged in the work that I do, but if there's other students out there interested in learning more, they're more than welcome to send an email. That I have research projects ongoing, always looking for talented students to join in the work.
Thank you so much. Dr. Robillard, and again, a reminder, the questions are area of work or area of interest, others who share it at UBC, across the campuses, and opportunities for students to be involved.
Great, yeah, thanks, Ari, and it's a pleasure to be here with such esteemed colleagues on this panel. So as Ari mentioned during my bio, my area of interest really lies at the intersection of technology and brain health. And my lab is really interested in how we use technologies like social media and like social robots to support our brains across the lifespan. And a big focus of our lab is to look at the ethics of these technologies through the eyes of the end users. And so to really put aside our sort of expert-based preconceived notions about what we might think the benefits and harms of the devices and platforms are, and then just really make space for children, families, older adults, to share with us what their concerns are, what their hopes are, and what their expectations are. So that's a big focus of what we're doing. In terms of who shares this area of interest, I think a really interesting aspect of ethics and technology that will no doubt shine through today is that many people are studying it without necessarily realizing that they're studying ethics and technology, or without calling it ethics and technology. And so other examples of people who share this interest, of course, the various groups involved with Neuroethics Canada have a long-standing interest in the ethics of neurotechnology, with the ILLIS group making great strides in the areas of neurosurgery, for example. There's also at UBC a research cluster that I believe spans UBC Vancouver and UBC Okanagan, called the Design for People cluster. And this is a multidisciplinary group that was created in recognizing the complexity and the constraints of new technologies, and the potential for inequity and harm that comes from their adoption and their sustained use. And so that cluster really brings together experts in many different domains, including computer science, nursing, neuroscience, data science, to look at these technologies and to develop them in a way to have a positive social impact, which I really believe represents ethics and technology. In terms of ways to get involved, attending this session is a great first start. I should mention that Neuroethics Canada has a newsletter you can sign up for, which will then make you aware of events like these, and we host quite a few of them. And there's also a lot of different points and entries if you want to be involved in research a little more closely. All the labs at Neuroethics Canada warmly welcome undergraduate student researchers through programs like WorkLearn or directed studies. And I should mention that there's also a neuroethics course planned for the upcoming neuroscience undergraduate program at UBC. So lots of opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Rodney, we'll pass it over to you. Let me know if you would like the prompts. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, I thought you were in control of the mute. Sorry, I forgot that I'd also put it on. So it's a great privilege to be here. I think this is a wonderful event to host. And I think for those of us who are interested in ethics from whatever discipline we come from, this is exactly the kind of dialogue that we should be having. So I'm now an associate professor emerita, which means that I'm on the I won't call it the end of the career because it's still very busy and I'm loving every minute of it, but in a different phase than starting up. And I suppose in some ways that gives me a different perspective on the questions that I might have otherwise have had 30 years ago. It's been a great joy to be engaged in ethics. I came to it as a practicing registered nurse who had been working in critical care, which even decades ago was very high intensity in terms of technology. And that got me really interested in, as an ICU nurse, seeing the suffering that people were going through, the importance of good biomedicine to support them. I really became interested in some of the values conflicts that can arise from not being certain whether we're doing the right thing, for not necessarily being able to support families in their grief as much as we would want to. So I became really interested in the concept of moral distress, which is the anger, frustration, guilt, and powerlessness that people can experience when they're not sure that they're doing the right thing. And that concept was just emerging at the time. There's since been a great deal of work done on it, particularly led by nursing, but increasingly picked up now by people in other disciplines. It's a hallmark of being a professional, is having moral obligations and struggling when we're unable to fulfill those moral obligations. That sent me back to UBC, sent me back to grad school, and I had the wonderful opportunity to do both a master's and a PhD at the UBC School of Nursing with fabulous mentors, including Dr. Michael McDonald from the Center for Applied Ethics, who is a philosopher and graciously mentored those of us. There were two of us particularly interested in ethics. My colleague, Dr. Rosalie Starzonski, who I'm still working with and co-writing a book with. She and I were very interested in understanding how philosophy fit with some of what we were seeing clinically, and Michael was extremely good at helping us navigate that. So I do want to put a plug in for the Center for Applied Ethics because he helped generate that center. He's still involved with it, and there's a really flourishing group of interprofessional people there who I know many of you will know, but really is a wonderful resource. So I also was not only interested in moral distress, but became increasingly interested in issues of social justice related to healthcare delivery. And I think that was influenced by my second mentor, Dr. Joan Anderson, who's a professor emerita from the UBC School of Nursing, and really is a leading scholar in issues about post-colonialism, in issues about equity and so forth. So that combination of moral distress and understanding equity has been something that's definitely informed my career. Other UBC colleagues I've had a chance to work with, they're too numerous to mention all of them, but I do want to say that I've been greatly delighted to be able to engage with Dr. Barb Pessett from UBC Okanagan, who is a real leader in ethics research, and also working with other colleagues such as Dr. Sally Thorne at UBC, the UBC School of Nursing. My engagement has included multiple students over the years. Before this session, I thought I'd try counting. It was, but I've had the privilege of being on the committees of at least 28 people who've focused within the School of Nursing. Now, remember, I'm older, so this is a number of decades adding up. But I've just been blessed by having some wonderful people to work with, most of whom have taken the ethics and focused it back on clinical practice. And I still am engaged in some supervisory committee work, not as the main supervisor, but definitely as somebody who's there to cheerlead and support what's happening. I think that in terms of the challenges that I believe that we are addressing, which I think is the other set of questions that we have made progress on but have a ways to go, is absolutely issues of moral distress have not gone away, particularly with increased inequities in healthcare, poverty, and so forth at the societal level. And that links also to really wanting to look at issues of social justice even more, not just as understanding it as a concept, but what do we do about it? And so there are, in terms of some resources, there are increasingly faculty who are able to speak to that, and myself and two colleagues who are from the University of Victoria School of Nursing are working on a third edition of an ethics textbook to try to keep some of that thinking and that reflection going. And it's definitely been exciting and keeping us very busy. But that idea of learning from and with our students, our colleagues, and keeping moving as the context changes has been really a privilege. So I'll zip it now before I get a sort of a virtual pulled off the stage. But it's wonderful to talk about this, and I'm so keen to hear what everybody else has to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rodney. You may have actually anticipated our next question. And as we move into it, what are cutting-edge ethical issues in your area of interest? Or alternatively, can you give us an example of a specific ethical dilemma that you've encountered and how you have addressed it? Now, we're going to start with Dr. Robillard, if we could.
Sure. So thank you. So there's a lot of traditional, what I would like to call traditional ethical issues in the space of ethics and technology. And so like a perfect example of that is privacy. A lot of concerns around privacy. And so I want to sort of move away from these types of issues and really tell you about a newer area of ethics and technology that my lab is very interested in. And that has to do with the emotion that we feel towards technology. And so we all form bonds with objects, and that's not a new thing. And I get a lot of pushback when I say things like that, but if you're one of those people who's currently thinking, well, I don't form bonds with objects, I would like to just ask you to think about the last time that you misplaced your phone or that you left it at home and went to school, went to work. You, I'm sure, experienced some stress and some angst during that day. And that's stressful for many people. And it's not just because our phones are useful from a practical standpoint and they have our calendar and a calculator and things like that. It's also, I would argue, because they connect us to other people. And so we form a bond to that connection, and we form a bond to the channel that sort of enables us to be social and to interact with each other. And so the questions that we're asking in the lab that I think are cutting edge are things like, how much emotion is appropriate to experience towards a device? How much emotion should these devices express back to us? And then what are the implications of this emotional bond for things like stigma, for example? So you can imagine if you have a pet robot to help soothe your anxiety, you go to a coffee shop, this is a place with a lot of people, maybe you get funny looks because you're engaging with a robot. And so those are the kinds of questions that we're asking, so sort of from a very, very high level. And we're interested in these questions because the devices and the programs and the technologies that are designed to help you with your brain health or to support your brain health are increasingly designed in a way that promotes this bond. So the mental health mindfulness app, maybe that you're using, is going to ask you to set reminders, and it's going to send you push notifications to remind you to interact with the app. And that could be for good, so that you derive maximum benefit from your mindfulness app, but it could also be to expose you to more advertising, for example. The robots that we see on the market, they're increasingly designed to be cute and to be, soft and to have all these attributes that make us more inclined to use them or more inclined to feel emotion towards them. But all of these design features are done in absence of knowledge about the impact of this bond and what happens when the device no longer works, or what happens when it's too much of a bond and you're sort of now experiencing different harms related to that. And these are questions that may seem a little bit out there, but I guarantee you they're very much present day concerns. There's a lot of technologies around assessment for brain health that maybe can lead to a lot of anxiety. And these are technologies that exist today and that people are using today. And so a lot of this is still being examined. So part of your question prompt is sort of, how is this being addressed? I don't have answers for how this is being addressed, but what I can tell you is some of the tools that we're using to get those answers. And the first tool that I want to mention is, of course, deep engagement with end users about their preferences and their values and what they think is the appropriate amount of emotion and how they want the devices to respond back to them. And then, of course, in the lab, we're also using modeling as a way to sort of predict, are these emotions going to be harmful to the end user? Are they going to be beneficial to the end user? And so that helps us then sort of inform how we should move forward with these kinds of technologies. So that was my example. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now we'll move to Dr. Alam. Could you please tell us a little bit about the cutting edge ethical issues in your area of interest or any ethical dilemmas that you've encountered and overcome?
Yeah, maybe I can share two stories. One from the very early career. We all aware of climate change, but we have been fighting for it, for quite some time, although in research, and gradually we are now seeing it's being implemented in the industry. So when I started, the type of research I do, I have to work with a lot of different industries. And one was a startup company somewhere in 2009, 2010. Our intention was to replace cement because, cement production is quite energy intensive, and 1 kilogram of cement actually produces equivalent amount of carbon dioxide. So which means that this is really, really bad for the environment. So of course, there's a huge need to replace it. So there was one company in particular, we worked with them to develop, I will not name the company, but we developed polymer concrete that could fully replace cement. And it showed a great promise. But that when a startup company you work with, they have constraints of resources and funding, right? So when you are starting as your new career as an assistant professor, you also under a lot of pressure to produce a lot of things, right? And brings lots of novelty. So we were doing really good, but what happened is somewhere in between, because whenever you have to bring a product into the market, the most important thing is the safety, right? If you're building a structure, life safety is the most important, then you have to also consider many other aspects of maintenance costs, many things when you build a structure, for example. What are the long-term costs, for example? Now, when we got some very good results in terms of strength, its good properties, then the company was kind of aggressive. What they did, they went out because we submitted our initial results to the company, our first report. Based on that, they went out and applied for a huge contract, and they won that by showing our lab results. Okay, and then we actually had no idea what the company was doing because we were still in the research phase, and it's a long-term research because whenever you need to develop a new material, you need to go and understand what are the different durability properties, like how it will, disintegrate under different kind of harsh environment. So those are the things it takes time, but it looks like the company did not wait for our long-term results. Rather, they went out, win the contract, and started a big project utilizing this material. So, and we were doing our research, and it turns out that under certain environmental conditions, the material will underperform and might not, and may possibly disintegrate. So, but that is a conclusion we came after 2 years. But in the meantime, what happened, they built the structure, and that structure started to show disintegration after 1 year, which is almost the same time we are concluding. And that was the field observation that we're doing, which we are not aware of. So that led to actually big litigation against the company. And in the part of the litigation, they submitted our report, and which I was, again, not aware of. And then UBC, legal services, they came aware of that. And then, it went to all kinds of nasty things, which means that whenever we do something, we have to really think about, what are the risks associated with it? What could harm? Is there any potential that someone could be harmed by that, right? Who are the stakeholders? So all those things actually we need to think about. And when we publish something, we have to really understand what are our constraints, right? So if we do not understand our constraint, and if we overclaim something that which is not, like if we could say in that report that this is an excellent material, it is ready to be applied in the field, this has great promise, then it would really, really hunt me down, right? So since in our project report, we clearly distinguish like what the results are, what are the boundary constraints, and what are the other things that we should be doing. So that's why, adding that ethical sense while, presenting results is very, very important. So if you have time, then I can share another story, but we can also share it in another round of questions.
Thank you, Dr. Alam. That was an excellent story. And I'll ask you to hold your other one for either the questions or the breakout rooms. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Dr. Rodney, I will move on to you. Oh, let me unmute you. Oh no. Oh, there we go.
There we go. Got it. Sorry. So thank you for that very compelling story. It's the narrative about the challenges, I think, is enormously important, and I think that was a very strong beginning. So what I'd like to do is pick up on what I said about moral distress earlier, which is as I mentioned, the anger, frustration, guilt, and powerlessness that providers can experience and that we're increasingly understanding. But there's a major so what about what are we going to do about it? And figuring out how to meet that challenge has been the work of researchers in Canada, in the US as well. And I want to acknowledge a colleague from the Faculty of Medicine at UBC, Dr. Peter Dodek, who has been leading some really strong research on working towards interventions. And so myself and other colleagues have been able to join in with Peter on some of that work. And what he has done is to work with a colleague from the United States who has a moral distress assessment and intervention tool and has quite a large program of research where ideas are tried out to see what might make a difference for healthcare providers. So for example, the importance of being able to have regular debriefs, the importance of feeling listened to at an organizational level, and to be moving forward with that kind of work. And so what we're seeing is that many of us across Canada who are doing similar forms of research are connecting. Dr. Barb Pessett is very engaged with this kind of work as well from UBC Okanagan. And to think about, it's not good enough just to measure it and to identify it. We absolutely have a moral imperative to make a difference. And some of that work has been, and that I've had a chance to be part of as well, has been participatory research, where the staff themselves or the people involved become co-researchers with the team. It doesn't mean that the team abdicates responsibility. There's still a research team in charge, but that sense of having participation and participatory action research going means that the strategies and the solutions are co-created by the people on the front lines of care delivery, as well as those of us who are academics and trying to support the work. And so that's an area of a great deal of promise that has evolved over the last few years. And for example, I've had a chance to work in units, for example, a number of years ago at the Cancer Agency, where there's a lot of challenges about delivering quite potent medications and treatments, and often a lot of uncertainty, quite legitimately, about the outcomes because of the nature of the disease and the science. And so the opportunity to meet with groups of staff from across the professions to hear about their concerns and say, how can we feel better about the care we're delivering and also be able to offer the best care possible. So that ability to listen, to debrief, to co-plan has become much more of a focus with the kind of research that's going on regarding moral distress. And Dr. Peter Dodek's research as well is very much got a participatory flavor to listen to the people on the front lines about what will make a difference. That's probably the most important challenge and opportunity that we have. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Excellent answers from everyone. Now we will move on to our third question. Oh, Professor Byrne, I apologize. Can you please describe for us any cutting-edge ethical issues in your area of interest or any ethical dilemmas that you've encountered and how you've addressed it?
I'll answer it fairly quickly. And I'll share a simple but specific example. So let's imagine you're a park designer and you are choosing a bench. That's maybe the simplest description of a landscape architect. And you're first asked to decide between a plastic bench, a concrete bench, or a wooden bench. And you can probably see already that where I'm going with this, that each material has a different ethical connotation. Hydrocarbons linked to global warming, concrete is tied to global sand depletion, wood has a relationship to deforestation. So how you decide and what the decision says about you is an important matter for the landscape architect to be dealing with. A second follow-up question, how long is the bench? Does it accommodate one person sitting alone? Can two people sit in conversation? Or is it long enough to allow someone to stretch out and sleep on the bench? Finally, we could ask a third question. Where is the park located in the first place? Is it on ancestral, unceded territory? How do we understand the history of that place and the people that have shaped the land? So where do we put the bench to begin with? So let's say then you can see that climate change, species extinction, decolonization, spatial justice are overlapping in rich areas of work that require design responses. The field of landscape architecture is future-oriented, and I would say that's true of all design. It's projective, meaning that we imagine and then direct the construction of the world that everyone experiences. In this project, landscape architects are, of course, joined by building architects, urban designers, engineers. However, what sets apart the field of landscape architecture is the recognition that our designs are always carried out in collaboration with a greater than human world. So nature has always been a strong source of moral precepts. The challenge that landscape architects have is that we're also in the process of designing new nature.
Thank you so much. We'll move on to our third question now. And as an apology, Professor Byrne, we'll start with you. How can we facilitate better, more ethical practices in your area of interest? Professor Byrne? Yeah, great, sorry. I thought I was gonna have time to think more, so it's great, it's good. Let's say, as I was kind of saying at the start, that there's like, environmental ethics is a very rich territory. You could imagine on the bookshelf of the landscape architect, you'd find a collection like Thoreau's Walden or Leopold's Salkant's Almanac. We could think about Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. And these would be found in good company with the likes of Donna Haraway, Robin Wall Kimmerer, Naomi Klein, or Susan Simard. Again, the point I'm trying to make distinct about landscape architects is that we have to understand these kind of questions in environmental ethics and make them action-oriented, bring them into being in the future. So we need to think about the ethical decision-making process and how they inform the future world that we're constructing. That's the task of the landscape architect every day in their design work, is to think about how we will shape the future landscape spaces that the public will move to. Thank you so much. Dr. Rodney, we'll move on to you. How can we facilitate better, more ethical practices in your area of interest?
Hit that unmute button. Some of it I started to foreshadow in the last comments that I made. I think that what I would summarize this as is a sense of creating a moral community. That is a group of diverse healthcare providers, ideally families, community members, and others locally and provincially and nationally, where we talk about what our challenges are in terms of ethical practice in healthcare delivery, and create a moral community in the sense that we're coalition building, finding experts from various disciplines to work together. I gave you the example of the teamwork on the moral distress research that has been happening recently, has brought us forward a great deal. And I really want to put a shout out here to the importance of students coming into this kind of work, taking up issues of healthcare delivery and leadership that are certainly pragmatic, but also ethical, with a focus on healthcare ethics, understanding what goods we ought to be aiming for. And that is an area where I've seen tremendous progress. There's amazing grad students and new scholars jumping into the kind of values-based focus that we've been talking about. And it gives me absolutely enormous optimism for the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Robillard, we'll continue with you.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. I think in the area of ethics and technology, and certainly in health technology, greater ethical scholarship will come from multidisciplinary approaches. And I think every other speaker on this panel has alluded to this, Dr. Rodney more formally just now. But I'm thinking if every group that's designing a robot or a biomedical device or a mobile app to support health or brain health involves social scientists, ethicists, end users on their team, all these ethical issues will not only naturally emerge from these discussions and from this kind of engagement, but they'll also have a chance to be addressed proactively. We'll have a chance to address the thing as we are thinking about them, as we are envisioning the potential benefits and harms of these devices, and really addressing these ethical issues proactively is the best case scenario here. It's what we're trying to accomplish. I think there's increasingly a recognition of the value of these interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary approaches. I think granting agencies, universities, and even to some extent the tech industry are realizing that we need to bring all this diversity of voices at the table, make sure all the collaborations are equal and meaningful. And I think moving forward, it'll be really important to make sure that all the voices are not just represented, but also heard. So if we're at the table and end users are saying, well, I wouldn't use this because I'm concerned about ethical issue ABC, it's not a question of just saying, we did end user engagement, check. It's also a question of really taking that into meaningful consideration and developing the product in a way that is responsive and respectful of the input that we'd be soliciting through those means.
Thank you so much. And let's move on to Dr. Alam. How can we facilitate better, more ethical practices in your area of interest?
Yeah. Thank you. So in our area, there's a gradual shift in the thought process. I agree with all the panelists about the point of, having multidisciplinary aspect, because initially what we used to do whenever we choose the construction material or we design a structure, we were thinking of, mainly about the stakeholders and decision makers. And most important thing was, the structure we are building, whether it is safe or whether it can help save lives in case there is a catastrophic event or whatnot. Now, gradually, what we are observing that our thought process will be initially, for example, if there is an earthquake, then we want the structure may collapse, but the life safety will be ensured. But now, the way we are thinking that we should not also sacrifice our structure. It should also stand. We will ensure not only the safety of the life, but also the structure so that the life cycle cost can be significantly reduced. Otherwise, think about if we demolish the structure after a major earthquake, and then again, we have to rebuild. And the amount of carbon emission associated with deconstruction and reconstruction will be massive, right? So we want to avoid that part. So in our design process, that's how we are integrating life cycle cost analysis before we build the structure. Then that's where also, another ethical question comes that, whether we are doing enough about the safety of the structure itself, not only the life safety. So I have some example, maybe in our next question, I will have time, so then I can talk about another example. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Alam. We are going to move into our question and answer session. So thank you to our panelists for sharing your insights. Now I would like to open the floor to our audience members to ask questions or share what they have learned, either by using the hand raise function or typing in the chat. A gentle reminder that there will also be an opportunity to go behind the scenes with a panelist shortly. We only have a short period of time for this portion of the program, so I would like to ask that you make your question concise so that we can get in as many as possible. And I will be, we will be monitoring the chat, and you can use the hand raise function to pop up.
Will I go with the first question? Like the first question was, could you define what ethics means to you?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I see an opportunity to share that example. So for me as a material and structure engineer, ethics means whatever I'm doing so that it will not cause any harm, so that it's risk-free, so that it will not, of course, it's simply impossible to have anything risk-free there, but risk can be substantially minimized. So just to give you an example, as a researcher, we do lots of things, and then often we have to share things in media. I was working on a project with the BC Ministry of Transportation to determine the seismic vulnerability of BC highway bridges. They have about 3,000 highway bridges. And when you are dealing with some specific bridge, many of the bridges are very old and could be vulnerable under seismic condition. And we know, certain bridges, right? And that also helps the ministry to allocate their funds, where they need to rehabilitate or retrofit. Now, when the media came to know about the study, they wanted to, for example, interview me from CBC and Global News. During my interview, they were specifically asking me question, okay, can you tell me which particular bridge is more vulnerable or vulnerable? So if I, think that, okay, that's important for me to make public aware that that particular bridge in that city is vulnerable, then is it like am I doing justice? Like, does it going to harm others by providing this information? So that's an important question. So we have to really think about like what kind of information we can disseminate to the media. For example, if I could share that particular information, it means that right away the ministry cannot do anything about it, right? Because it takes time. Rather, it will create huge public nuisance and fear among them. Rather, my responsibility is to, say in general that, we identified where, the ministry could look at and allocate resources to make structure safer. So rather, if I would say that, okay, this particular bridge is really vulnerable, then that's not going to do any good to the public, right? Rather, I should go to the ministry and share my knowledge and information like what I got from my study, and they take the right measure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Would any of our other panelists like to tackle that question? What does ethics mean to you?
Yeah, so you're able to hear me all right? I think the most simple definition and probably the most powerful definition of ethics that helps me is to think of the difference between what is going on or is happening and what ought to be happening, what ought to be going on. That, of course, relies on our professional judgment, our assessment of context, and it really focuses in on the strategizing about how to get there. All of us are in active professions where doing is an enormous part of what we are obligated to pursue. And so understanding how to move from what is happening to what ought to happen, I believe, is for me the heart of ethics.
Thank you so much. Professor Byrne and Dr. Robillard, if you'd like to hop in on this, I welcome you to. Otherwise, we can move to the next one.
I can provide a very short answer. In our lab, the way that we conceptualize ethics and the research that we're doing is what is the balance of benefits and harms? And then we run into a lot of interesting questions like harms for whom? And who decides what is a benefit? And what do those look like? And how long of a duration is a benefit? And so there's a lot of really interesting questions there, but that's just how we consider ethics to be.
Yeah, I can repeat the exact same thing, and maybe down the list of questions that are popping up, we can see this theme coming up, that it's a balancing between doing good or doing wrong. And with some of the questions here leaning towards an optimization, how can we do the greatest good possible with our actions? And so it's also worth remembering that what constitutes doing good is historically and culturally constructed. And so in academia, we have the opportunity to be thinking about definitions of good, how they're constructed, and understanding that they're subject to change. So we can also be driving the transformation of those definitions into the future.
Thank you so much, Professor. We have a question from a guest. How do we reconcile when the capabilities of technology outperform humans, as in the potential for AI in imaging, as one example? And this would apply differently in each of your fields. Would anybody be able to speak to that?
Yeah, please go ahead.
I can get us started, but I look forward to the other perspectives. This is a very tricky question, and it's I'm less familiar in the imaging realm, but in the social robot realm, we talk about this a lot. If we develop a care robot, what are the implications for the care jobs that end up being somewhat replaced? But this is a problematic use of terms, and I would challenge you to find any care robot company that is framing their product in terms of replacing humans. And so we prefer to see social robots in this case as supplementing or complementing human care. And so I don't see this necessarily as a threat that it may seem when you watch episodes like Black Mirror and TV shows like that. But possibly others have different thoughts on this topic.
I agree with what you just mentioned. Like this could be complementary. For example, we use machine learning algorithm to predict responses of a structure. And you can also use artificial intelligence to do the structural design. So, but of course there is fear, because at the end, if there is any mistake, like whom you are going to make responsible. In our design aspect, we have introduced performance-based design so that, if there is a faulty design, the particular professional who has designed the structure could be made responsible, so that, ethically what we are supposed to do, we are doing it, thinking our mind about those safety issues. Now, if you are asking AI to do it, then whom you are going to make responsible, and where are those ethical aspects that sometimes you may have to consider during your design, right? So that becomes quite complex. So from our perspective, it could be complementary.
Thank you so much. I want to throw this to Professor Byrne and Dr. Rodney as well. Could you please describe how, or if in any way, machine learning might pose new ethical challenges in your field?
I could maybe offer that, if it's okay, I'll just be very quick, so that's why I jumped in, that I could offer that maybe there's some parallel to thinking about a kind of more than human nature as having a relationship to this question, that the kind of fear of an artificial intelligence is being able to make ethical decisions, and if that extends beyond human decision making, I think there'd be some opportunity to wonder also about, does nature itself have any ethical decision-making processes? Is ethics solely the domain of a human intelligence, or does it extend beyond that? And so within our field, we're thinking a lot about what constitutes nature, how it's defined, and or its relationship to human cultures and society. And so that's just where my question would go back to the asker, thinking about that.
So I think that's an enormously important question that we need a lot more work on. And I am aware of a faculty member at the UBC School of Nursing who is doing some work with the use of robots with elderly people in care homes, care facilities, and so forth. And her research, I think, is working on trying to address some of those questions. I do believe that the most important thing is to ask the right questions, to not assume that our technology is going to be flawless or not cause harms, and also not to assume that it won't work. It means that I believe we need to collaborate with our colleagues within our disciplines and across disciplines, much like what this session is modeling, to ask rich, deep questions, stay humble, and stay optimistic. And I believe that there's a way we can do that. A lot of that means that the interprofessional connections that we have are enormously important. How we collaborate with each other, how we listen to each other, how we share wisdom, because we definitely need lots of it and a lot more. And certainly I'm seeing that happening in the academy a great deal more than it used to be. We've moved out of a strict competitive realm into more of a collaborative realm, which I also think, I noticed there's a question about who gets to decide what ought to be happening. I can come to that in a minute if that's appropriate for our chair. But I think that it's similar kinds of issues come with that question as well.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. We are going to move into our final question. Thank you to our audience members as well for submitting these amazing questions. And due to time constraints, I ask that our panelists limit their answers to one sentence if possible. Based on today's discussion, if you could share one resource with us, such as a book, article, or podcast, what would it be? And Dr. Rodney, you're already unmuted, so I'll ask you to start first.
I'm going to cheat a little bit and suggest an author. Dr. Nuala Kenny, Kenny, is a member of a group of faculty at Dalhousie who've done some enormously important reading on relational ethics and really about looking at people within their social context. So Dr. Nuala Kenny and her colleagues at Dalhousie University. So they've got several books. I cheated a bit with the answer.
Perfectly okay. Thank you so much. Professor Byrne, any resources that you would like to share?
Yeah, maybe I could just share a prompt that when I was mentioning earlier the likes of Susan Smart, Naomi Klein, or Donna Haraway, maybe I enter a prompt that when reading such a book, it's very useful to think about what does a world look like on the other side of these kind of writings. How do we envision a future that's better than the present that we're looking through? So yeah, that's the prompt that I share.
Thanks so much. Dr. Alam, if you could share a resource or two with the audience.
Yeah, Gary Comstock wrote a book, and this is published by Cambridge. The title is Research Ethics. This is a good book to follow. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. And Dr. Robillard, if you had a resource or two to share.
I do, and I've just put it in the chat. It's our Neuroethics Canada blog, so I'm going a little bit rogue here. But our trainees and staff and faculty put in a great deal of effort in covering some of the issues that we talked about today. So please go have a visit.
Thank you so much. We will be posting all of these recommended resources to the Neuroethics Canada website. And before we move to the optional behind the scenes breakout sessions, I'd like to promote the Center for Applied Ethics Fellowship Program to any graduate or postgraduate students at UBC. It's an excellent way to develop your ethical toolkit. Of course, thank you to Dr. Gail Murphy for her opening remarks. our distinguished panelists, and of course, you, our audience members, for attending. The third session of Ethics for UBC focuses on ethics in policy, business, and law, and is coming up on March 30th. You will each receive information about the next panels and a very brief follow-up survey to further the goals of the Ethics for UBC series. Thank you for joining, and see you at the next one.